The moment a child sees fear in a grown man's eyes, childhood changes shape. At 3:17 on a bright Thursday afternoon, the front of Brookdale Academy looked exactly the way expensive schools in suburban America always do at pickup. Clean sidewalks, polished glass doors, SUVs idling in a neat line, and parents checking phones while the late sun turned every window into a sheet of gold. Nia Ellison came bursting out through the double doors with a backpack bouncing against her shoulders and a piece of construction paper clutched carefully in both hands, the corners bent from excitement instead of carelessness. She had been waiting all day to show it to her father. Across the pickup lane, Marcus Ellison stood near the curb in a dark navy jacket and open-collar shirt. One hand raised the second he saw her, his face softening into the kind of smile only a daughter could pull from a man who carried too much responsibility. He had promised her he would be there on time. Not close. Not almost. On time. And for Nia, that promise meant everything. She ran toward him with the full-hearted speed of an 8-year-old who still believed the world made sense when the right person showed up. But before she reached him, a sharp voice cut through the noise like something cold dragged across glass. "Sir, step back from the child." Nia slowed so suddenly her sneakers squeaked against the painted pavement. Marcus turned, confused at first, as Officer Daniel Mercer moved in with the authority of someone used to being obeyed before he was understood. He wore the school district police badge like it explained every decision he was about to make. One parent nearby had already gone still, then another, the way crowds do when they sense a scene forming and instinctively lean toward it instead of away. Marcus kept his voice calm, almost careful. He said that Nia was his daughter. He said he was there to pick her up. He said the school had his information on file. But Mercer's expression never changed. It settled into that particular kind of certainty that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with assumption. Nia looked from the officer to her father and back again, her fingers tightening around the paper until the edges curled. "He's my dad," she said, first in confusion, then louder when no one moved. "That's my dad." The words should have ended it. They should have snapped the whole misunderstanding in half. Instead, Mercer stepped closer and told Marcus to place his hands where he could see them. A few parents drew out their phones. Someone whispered something about safety. Someone else murmured that they had never seen him before. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not argue like a man trying to win. He spoke like a father trying not to frighten his little girl. "Nia," he said, and even from several feet away, his tone reached her more gently than the afternoon light. "Look at me, baby." She did, though her eyes were already wet. "Breathe," he told her. That was when Mercer took hold of his wrist to pull him back from the curb, and the picture in Nia's hands slipped free and floated to the ground between them. It landed face up. In thick crayon letters, under a drawing of a tall man in a blue suit with one small hand wrapped around his finger, were the words she had practiced 3 times before getting them right. "My hero." And in the silent second before everything changed, no one there seemed to understand they were about to witness the cost of getting a good man completely wrong. Marcus Ellison had learned a long time ago that the world often decided what kind of man you were before you ever opened your mouth. That was why he had built the habit of calm so deeply it lived in his bones. While Officer Mercer kept a hard grip on the moment and the small crowd around them leaned into judgment, Marcus stood with the stillness of someone who understood that one wrong movement, one sharp word, even one flash of anger on his face, could be turned into a story that would follow his daughter longer than the truth ever would. Nia remained frozen near the curb, her chest rising too fast, her eyes fixed on her father as though she were waiting for him to do what fathers in movies always do, step forward, explain everything, and make the confusion disappear. But real life did not move that way, and Marcus knew it. He also knew that fear in a child spreads quickly when adults stop acting like adults. So instead of defending himself first, he defended the only thing that mattered to him in that instant, the fragile sense of safety inside his little girl. "You are all right," he told her, his voice low and steady, as if they were the only 2 people in the pickup lane. "Stay with your teacher and keep breathing for me." The words were simple, but Nia had heard them before. He used them on thunderstorms, on scraped knees, on nights when shadows in her bedroom looked bigger than they really were. He had spent years teaching her that calm was not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear tell the whole story. That was the kind of father he was. Not loud, not performative, not trying to impress the world, just constant in the ways that mattered. He packed her lunch when his schedule allowed it. He showed up to school plays even when he had to come straight from meetings. He remembered the names of her stuffed animals, the one song she always wanted in the car on Fridays, and the fact that she hated grapes unless they were cut in half. To anyone glancing over from the line of expensive vehicles and pressed blazers, he looked like a composed black father in a tense situation. What they could not see was the entire architecture of care behind him. The missed dinners, the early flights, the complicated life arranged around one promise he never wanted his daughter to question: "I will come back for you." The late afternoon air carried the smell of hot pavement and fresh mulch from the flower beds by the entrance. Somewhere behind the glass doors, a secretary was still speaking into a phone. A bell chimed from inside the building, soft and distant, as if the school itself had not yet caught up to what was happening outside. Principal Laura Whitman appeared on the front steps with a strained expression, one hand pressed to a tablet against her chest, and Marcus saw the familiar look in her eyes, not cruelty exactly, but hesitation dressed up as procedure. It was the look of someone who wanted this handled quickly, neatly, and without forcing herself to decide what was right. Officer Mercer asked again for identification, but the question no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like an accusation that had already made up its mind. Marcus could have said more. He could have reached for the truth that would stop everything in a second. Instead, he looked down at the drawing on the pavement, at the crayon letters spelling out what his daughter believed about him, and understood with a sudden heaviness that what happened next might change not what she called him, but how she understood the world around him. Officer Daniel Mercer had the kind of confidence that grows in places where nobody important ever tells a man he is wrong. In Brookdale Academy's pickup lane, with its trimmed hedges, polished stone sign, and parents who treated order like a second religion, that confidence moved through him like ownership. He was not especially tall, not especially imposing, but he wore certainty with such ease that people stepped aside for it before they examined whether it was deserved. To the families who knew him by face more than name, he was the officer who kept the campus safe, the man in uniform who made wealthy parents feel their children were protected from anything unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, in places like that, often had very little to do with facts. Mercer's gaze stayed fixed on Marcus with a cool suspicion that only deepened the calmer Marcus became. It irritated him, that composure. He had expected excuses, defensiveness, maybe even fear loud enough to justify his instincts. Instead, he got a man who answered plainly, stood carefully, and kept directing his attention toward his daughter instead of the crowd. There was something in that self-control Mercer did not know how to read, so he translated it into defiance. Around them, the rhythm of dismissal changed shape. Car doors stopped closing. Engines kept running. A woman in a white sweater held her phone chest high, pretending not to record while clearly recording. Another parent leaned toward the person beside him and whispered behind one cupped hand, his face wearing the thin, eager concern people use when they want to seem responsible while enjoying the spectacle. Principal Laura Whitman came down 2 more steps from the entrance and stopped there, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to claim later that she had not seen. The tablet against her chest reflected the lowering sun in a hard rectangle of light. She asked Mercer, in a tight voice meant to sound professional, whether the situation was under control. It was the wrong question, and Marcus knew at the moment it left her mouth, because it assumed the situation had already been defined by the loudest person in it. Nia looked so small standing there by the yellow curb paint, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, her drawing still on the pavement where the breeze kept worrying at one corner. A young teacher reached her at last and laid a careful hand on her shoulder, but even that touch carried uncertainty, as if the adults around her were taking cues from the badge instead of the child who actually knew the truth. Marcus watched all of it with a quiet grief that did not touch his face, but settled somewhere deeper. He had been in rooms with senators, judges, agency heads, and men who thought the fate of entire cities should bend to the force of their opinions. He knew power in all its forms. He knew how it sounded when it announced itself, and how it looked when it hid behind words like policy and concern. What stood before him now was not real authority. It was borrowed confidence, sharpened by a setting that rewarded quick assumptions and wrapped prejudice in the language of safety. Mercer asked for identification again, slower this time, as if speaking to someone already guilty. Marcus said the school had emergency pickup authorization on file, and Whitman finally looked down at her tablet, but only for a second, only long enough to avoid meeting his eyes. In that tiny hesitation, Marcus understood something important. The danger here was not one officer making one bad call. It was a whole environment prepared to trust the appearance of order over the presence of truth. And somewhere inside the building, the clock moved toward another minute, while outside, the afternoon kept glowing with the cruel brightness of a day that looked beautiful from a distance and felt nothing like mercy up close. Marcus understood that the next choice he made would live inside his daughter longer than this afternoon ever would. That was the terrible mathematics of moments like these. Children did not always remember every word adults said, but they remembered tone, posture, breath, and whether the person they trusted most became smaller under pressure or somehow stood taller without moving at all. So Marcus made a decision that looked simple from the outside and cost him everything on the inside. He did not reach for the truth that could end the scene in a single sentence. He did not offer the name, title, or influence that would force every face around him to rearrange itself in shame. He let the silence sit where power expected panic, and in doing so, he chose his daughter over his own pride. Officer Mercer mistook that restraint for weakness. He spoke again, sharper now, telling Marcus that refusal to cooperate would only make matters worse. The line sounded practiced, something polished by repetition until it no longer needed thought behind it. Marcus turned his head just enough to find Principal Whitman on the steps. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tablet. "You have the emergency authorization on file," he said evenly. "Check the records. My daughter is registered for pickup under my name." It was a direct path toward truth, clean and verifiable, but Whitman hesitated in a way that made the air feel thinner. She glanced at Mercer first, not the tablet, and Marcus felt the full weight of how institutions fail people, not always through cruelty, but through the smaller cowardice of waiting to see which version of events will be safest to believe. Nia let out a broken little sound that did not even rise to the level of a sob. It was worse than crying because it carried confusion inside it. The young teacher beside her bent slightly and whispered something Marcus could not hear, but Nia did not take her eyes off her father. The paper on the pavement shifted again in the breeze, one corner tapping softly against the painted curb like a hand that did not know where to rest. Around them, more phones appeared. The crowd had found its posture now, that careful distance people keep when they want to witness everything without feeling responsible for any of it. Marcus knew what many of them saw: a black man in a tense exchange with a school police officer, a child nearby, a principal monitoring from the steps. Most of them would not ask whether the picture was accurate. They would ask whether it felt familiar enough to accept. Mercer asked Marcus for identification one more time, but before Marcus could answer, the officer reached for the phone in Marcus's hand. Marcus let it go without resistance. That simple surrender changed the energy in the crowd. A few people read it as compliance. Others read it as confirmation. None of them understood that Marcus had just allowed himself to be made smaller in public because his daughter was watching, and he wanted her to learn that dignity did not need an audience to remain intact. "Please do not frighten my child," he said, and the sentence landed strangely in the bright afternoon, too gentle for the spectacle forming around it. Mercer did not respond to the humanity in it. He responded to the request as though it were another challenge to his authority. Whitman finally looked down at her tablet and began tapping the screen, but her motions were hurried and uncertain, the movements of someone who had waited too long and knew it. Marcus watched her with the calm patience of a man who had spent years in rooms where timing changed outcomes. He also knew that out here, in front of his daughter, timing was already changing something far more fragile. The late sun had dipped lower now, and the long shadows from the school's columns stretched across the pickup lane until they nearly reached Nia's shoes. She looked caught between light and shade, between trust and fear, between the world she woke up in that morning and the one unfolding in front of her now. Marcus met her eyes and gave her the smallest nod he could manage, not because he believed the moment was under control, but because fathers sometimes have to lend their children a sense of safety they no longer feel themselves. And just as Principal Whitman's face began to change, Just as whatever she found on that screen started to push color out of her cheeks, the sound of approaching engines rolled in from the far end of the drive, low, precise, and entirely out of place in the polished quiet of Brookdale Academy. The engines did not roar the way ordinary vehicles do when they arrive too fast. They came in low and controlled, a measured sound that seemed to slice through the heat shimmer above the pavement and through the noise of parents, phones, and whispered certainty. Every head in the pickup lane turned at once. Two black sport utility vehicles rolled past the stone entrance and stopped with the kind of precision that did not belong to nervous school traffic or local routine. Even before the doors opened, something in the air changed. It was not louder. It was more exact. Principal Whitman lowered her tablet just enough for Marcus to see that her hand was shaking. Officer Mercer, still anchored in the confidence that had carried him this far, glanced toward the driveway with irritation instead of concern, as though the interruption itself offended him. Nia looked up too, her face wet and pale under the slanting afternoon light, one hand still clenched around the strap of her backpack, while the other hung loose at her side. The drawing remained on the ground between painted curb lines and expensive shoes, the words in crayon bright against the concrete, now gathering dust at the edges. The first vehicle door opened, and a woman stepped out in a dark suit cut, so sharply it seemed to carry its own authority. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, her pace quick without ever becoming rushed. A second figure followed, then a third, all of them moving with the silent coordination of people who did not need to announce importance because the room, or in this case the school driveway, always learned it soon enough. Mercer lifted his chin and called out that this was an active situation, the kind of phrase meant to reclaim control simply by saying it aloud. But the woman did not stop. She walked directly past the parents filming, past Whitman frozen on the steps, and straight toward Marcus with a focus so absolute that for the first time Mercer's certainty thinned around the edges. Marcus did not call to her. He did not change expression. He only watched as the small theater of borrowed authority around him began to meet something larger, something real, something that had never needed the crowd's approval to exist. Nia stared at the woman as if trying to decide whether she was help or just another adult who would fail to listen. Then the woman's eyes found Marcus, and in that instant her face changed, not into panic, but into the hard stillness of professional alarm. She turned to Mercer and held up a badge that flashed gold in the dying sun. Her voice, when it came, was cool and level and so utterly free of doubt that the entire line of idling cars seemed to fall silent around it. "Officer, remove your hands from him. Now." Mercer's mouth tightened. He demanded identification, jurisdiction, an explanation, any verbal foothold that might let him keep standing where he was. The woman did not even look at the phone cameras pointed toward them. She looked only at him, and when she spoke again, each word landed with the clean weight of fact. "You have detained Director Marcus Ellison." For one suspended second, nobody moved. The words did not register all at once. They traveled across the pickup lane in pieces, as if the crowd needed time to understand that the calm black father beside the curb was not merely a man insisting on the truth. He was a man the entire federal system knew by name. Principal Whitman's face lost what little color remained. One parent lowered her phone. Another took a step back, then another, as though distance might rewrite what had already happened. Mercer blinked once, then twice, and Marcus saw the first crack open inside him. Not guilt yet, not even shame, but disbelief that the world he had arranged so confidently around his own judgment had just shifted underneath his feet. Nia looked from the woman to her father, and Marcus gave her the same small, steadying look he had given before, only now it carried something else with it, not triumph, not anger, but sorrow. Because the truth had arrived exactly when it should have, and still too late to protect his daughter from seeing how easily people can mistake a good man for a threat when all they trust is the costume of power. For a long breath, the world at Brookdale Academy seemed to forget how to move. The late sun still poured across the glass doors. Engines still idled in the pickup lane. A loose paper cup still rolled a few inches near the curb before settling against a tire. But the people inside that moment changed completely. Officer Mercer stepped back the way a man does when certainty leaves him all at once and does not bother to apologize on its way out. The woman from the first vehicle, Special Agent Rebecca Sloan, did not raise her voice again. She did not need to. Real authority rarely arrives with noise. It arrives with clarity, and clarity had just fallen over the entire school like a cold shadow. Marcus stood where he was, composed in the same dark jacket, his hands now free, his face unreadable except for the exhaustion pressing quietly behind his eyes. He did not straighten himself in triumph. He did not ask whether everyone understood now. He did not enjoy the silence that had replaced suspicion. He only turned to find his daughter. Nia had not moved much since the words were spoken, as if her small body had been waiting for permission to believe what her heart already knew. Then she dropped her backpack strap and ran. Marcus met her halfway, lowering himself to one knee as she reached him, folding into him with the fierce, trembling grip of a child who had been holding herself together through pure confusion. He wrapped both arms around her and closed his eyes for half a second, not because the danger had been great in the way headlines like to define danger, but because something sacred had been disturbed, and fathers feel that kind of thing in places too deep for language. "I am here," he whispered into her hair. "I have got you." Nia nodded against his shoulder, trying to breathe the way he had taught her, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow enough to convince the body that safety had returned even when the heart still lagged behind. Around them, nobody seemed to know where to look. Some parents lowered their phones, ashamed not only that they had recorded, but that they had needed proof before offering doubt. Others stared at Marcus with that awkward, searching expression people wear when they realize they have mistaken composure for powerlessness and now must face the difference between those two things. Principal Whitman finally descended the rest of the steps, but whatever words had gathered in her throat were too late and too small. Her apology began in her face before it reached her mouth, but Marcus did not turn toward it. His attention remained on Nia, on the drawing Agent Sloan had bent to retrieve from the pavement, on the corner that had smeared slightly where dust had caught the crayon. Sloan handed it to him with both hands, a gesture so respectful it seemed to restore a little of what the afternoon had taken. Marcus looked down at the picture, at the blue suit, the small hand, the careful block letters of my hero, and something almost invisible shifted in his expression. Not pride. Something sadder. The knowledge that children draw their parents as larger than life because they do not yet know how often the world tries to make them smaller. Mercer still stood a few feet away, stunned into a silence that no longer protected him. His face had gone pale beneath the flush of the heat, and his eyes kept moving from Marcus to Sloan to Whitman, as if searching for a version of events that would place him back in control. But that version was gone. Marcus rose slowly with Nia's hand in his, and when he finally looked at Mercer, it was not with fury. That was what unsettled the crowd most. Mercy is hardest to understand when everyone is bracing for revenge. Marcus did not speak to humiliate him. He did not use the title that now hung over the scene like a verdict. He only held his daughter's hand, felt her fingers tighten around his, and understood that the real injury had never been to his name. It had been to her innocence. And in the deepening gold of that suburban afternoon, with the school windows glowing and every witness trapped inside their own shame, Marcus knew this moment was no longer just about being recognized. It was about what happens after recognition comes too late. The truth did not explode. It settled. That was what made it unbearable for everyone who had chosen the wrong side of the moment. No sirens followed the reveal, no dramatic speech, no sudden chaos to let the guilty hide inside confusion. Instead, there was only the clean, merciless quiet of facts taking their rightful place. Agent Sloan stepped slightly to Marcus's side, not in front of him, not above him, but beside him, as though even in correction she understood what the rest of the school had failed to see all afternoon. Dignity does not need rescuing, only recognition. Nia stayed close, one small hand holding onto her father's jacket, the other pressing the drawing against her chest now that it had been returned to her. Her breathing had slowed, but not all the way. Children recover in layers. The first layer is when the crying stops. The second is when trust returns. That second part takes longer. Marcus could feel it in the way she leaned into him, not with fear anymore, but with the fragile caution of someone making sure the ground would not suddenly shift again. Principal Whitman finally found her voice and stepped forward, her shoes clicking sharply against the pavement in the hush. She began with Marcus's name, then paused as if even that had become difficult to carry. Her apology came out polished at first, the way institutional language always does when it tries to sound humane without admitting too much. She said there had been confusion. She said protocol had been followed imperfectly. She said the school would review what happened. But even before she finished, the words had already failed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face calm in a way that made her sound even smaller. He had spent enough years around public statements to know when remorse was sincere and when it was still negotiating with liability. Officer Mercer remained a few feet away, no longer occupying the center of the scene, but unable to leave it either. His shoulders had lost their earlier firmness. The badge on his chest, so commanding an hour ago, now looked almost decorative, like something pinned to a version of himself that no longer existed. He opened his mouth once as though to explain, then stopped. The silence around him was too complete. There was no room left for instinct, no room for the easy language of safety and suspicion that had carried him this far. Only consequence remained. Marcus looked at him then, truly looked at him, and what passed through his expression was not triumph, but recognition of a different kind. He knew Mercer had expected anger. Maybe he had even braced for it, because anger would have made the story easier for him. Anger would have let him retreat into defensiveness, claim tension, misunderstanding, heat of the moment. But Marcus gave him nothing that simple. "You should have listened to my daughter," he said quietly. That was all. No lecture. No threat. No raised voice. Just a single sentence, soft enough that the crowd leaned in to hear it and heavy enough that nobody there would forget it. Mercer lowered his eyes, and for the first time since the afternoon began, he looked less like a man in authority than a man forced to meet the smallest and most devastating truth of all. A child had spoken clearly, and he had considered his own assumptions more trustworthy than her love for her father. Nia glanced up at Marcus after he said it, and something shifted in her face, something subtle but important. She had just watched a grown man with every reason to humiliate another choose restraint instead. She had watched her father refuse the cheap pleasure of revenge. Around them, the sunlight had deepened into evening gold, laying long warm bars across the school steps and the line of waiting vehicles. The same place that had felt cold with judgment now felt exposed, as if the light itself had turned honest. Agent Sloan took a small step closer and murmured that the director's car was ready whenever he wished to leave. Marcus nodded, but he did not move immediately. He looked once more at the school doors, at the polished glass reflecting everyone back at themselves, and understood that this was no longer just one ugly afternoon in a pickup lane. It was the beginning of something much larger, because scenes like this never end where they happen. They travel. They reach kitchens, newsrooms, meeting tables, city offices. They ask every witness who they were when it mattered. And as Marcus stood there with his daughter's hand in his, and the whole school held inside its own shame, the first phone in the crowd began to ring. By morning, the story had already broken loose from Brookdale Academy and begun moving through the country with the speed only outrage and video can generate. It started with shaky phone footage from the pickup lane, a child's voice saying, "That is my dad," followed by the stillness that came after the truth was spoken aloud. By noon, it was on local news. By evening, it was everywhere. Parents who had stood there in silence now watched themselves from kitchen islands and living room couches, seeing in replay what fear and social habit had hidden from them in real time. Officer Mercer was placed on immediate administrative leave before the sun went down, then suspended pending formal investigation before the week was over. Principal Whitman issued a public statement, then another, each one more careful than the last, but no sequence of polished sentences could undo the image of a little girl watching adults doubt what she knew in her bones. Brookdale Academy announced an internal review. The school district promised transparency. The city promised cooperation. But promises made after public embarrassment always sound different. From promises made before harm is done, and people could hear the difference. Marcus did not go on television. He did not call a press conference. He did not stand behind a podium and use the story to enlarge himself. That surprised many of the people around him, especially those who believed power existed mainly to be displayed. Instead, he spent the first night at home sitting at the edge of Nia's bed while she slept with the repaired drawing on her nightstand and the hallway light left on a little longer than usual. The next morning he made her pancakes, shaped badly enough to make her smile despite herself. He drove her to school only after asking whether she wanted to go back, and when she nodded, brave in the small, quiet way children often are, he held her hand all the way to the front entrance. The lawsuit came later, not as revenge, but as record. $35.7 million. The number hit headlines first because big numbers always do, but the money was never the soul of it. The real force of the case was what it named: racial profiling, emotional harm, institutional failure, negligence disguised as policy, and the cost of teaching a child that truth can be ignored when authority is more comfortable with suspicion. Depositions followed. Emails surfaced. Training gaps became visible. Parents who had once praised the school's commitment to safety began asking what safety meant if it did not include the dignity of the people being judged. Mercer's career did not collapse in one dramatic instant. It unraveled the way false certainty always does, thread by thread, report by report, interview by interview, until the uniform that had once given him immediate credibility could no longer protect him from the record of what he had done. Whitman kept her position for a while longer, but the confidence around her office was gone. Board meetings stretched late into the night. Lawyers filled rows that used to hold parents. Policy binders grew thicker. Marcus attended only when necessary, and when he did, he spoke plainly. He said the issue was not his title. It was not his access. It was not even his pain. It was the fact that another father without resources, without federal protection, without cameras and legal teams, and people ready to answer one missing signal, might have walked away. With no correction at all. That was the sentence that changed the room. Because even then, with every advantage now visible, Marcus still refused to make himself the exception worth saving. He made himself the example that exposed the wound underneath the system. And when Principal Whitman finally sat across from him in a conference room weeks later, hands folded too tightly, voice drained of public polish, and offered the kind of apology that had at last reached the truth, Marcus listened in the same silence he had carried from the pickup lane. Then he said the one thing no one there could dismiss as strategy. "You did not just fail me," he told her. "You failed the child who trusted every adult in that place to know the difference between danger and a father waiting at the curb." Several weeks later, the afternoon light returned to Brookdale Academy in almost the same way it had before, warm across the brick, soft on the glass, turning the pickup lane into something that looked peaceful enough to fool a stranger. But Nia could feel the difference, and so could Marcus. Some places remember what happened inside them. Even when the landscaping is perfect and the paint has been touched up and the public statements have all been filed away. Marcus parked along the curb and stepped out in a simple charcoal sweater and dark slacks. No motorcade behind him, no cluster of agents making a point, no performance of power at all. He had made that choice on purpose. He wanted the last image his daughter carried from this place to be an ordinary one, a father arriving because he said he would. Nia climbed out beside him with a new drawing folder tucked under her arm. She had grown quieter in the weeks since that day, not broken, not withdrawn, just changed in the small, careful ways children do when they have learned something about the world they were supposed to learn much later. But she was still herself. She still tilted her head when she thought. She still pressed close to his side before letting go. She still wanted him to see what she had made before anyone else. They walked together toward the gate, hand in hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and sun-warmed concrete. Somewhere beyond the front office, a classroom door opened and closed. The same yellow curb line ran beside them, bright under the late light, but it no longer felt like a border between safety and humiliation. It was just paint now, just a line. At the entrance, a newly posted pickup protocol sign stood in a metal frame, its language revised, its tone more human than legal. Staff members wore visible badges. A counselor greeted students by name. Principal Whitman was gone. Officer Mercer was gone. The school had changed because it had been forced to, but Marcus knew something deeper had changed too. People had been made to see what they once mistook for normal. That mattered. Not enough, never enough, but it mattered. Nia stopped just before the doors and looked up at him. "Are you coming back this afternoon?" she asked, and the question carried no drama at all, which was exactly why it cut so deep. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that holds both tenderness and regret. "I will be here before the bell," he said. "Not almost." "Exactly." She studied his face for a second, as if measuring the promise against every reason a child might have to doubt, then nodded. Satisfied. She handed him a sheet of paper from the folder before turning to go inside. Marcus looked down at it after she disappeared through the glass doors. It was a new drawing. Not the one from that first afternoon, not the blue suit and the heroic outline rendered in thick, bright crayon. This one was simpler. A man and a little girl walking side by side under a wide gold sun, their hands linked, the school behind them small in the background. At the bottom, in neater writing than before, she had printed a sentence with the careful confidence of a child who now understood more than anyone had wanted her to. My dad did not have to be loud to be strong. Marcus stood there for a long moment with the paper in his hands while the afternoon moved gently around him. Parents came and went. A breeze lifted the edge of the page. The glass doors reflected sky and trees, and the outline of a man who had been underestimated, recognized too late, and still chosen grace when anger would have been easier. He folded the drawing once, carefully, and slipped it inside his jacket near his heart. Then he looked up at the school, at the windows holding the last of the daylight, and let out a slow breath that seemed to carry weeks of weight out of his chest. No speech followed. No camera waited for a final statement. The victory in moments like this is never loud. It lives in smaller things. In a child walking into a building without fear. In a father keeping his word. In a place that once failed being made to remember. Marcus turned and walked back toward the curb alone, his footsteps steady, the evening sun stretching his shadow long across the pavement. And in that quiet, with the wind moving softly through the trees and the school settling behind him, justice sounded less like applause than like peace finally arriving where pain had once stood first. Google Workspace.